and this is Talking Point. Have you ever caught yourself wondering how long you've been drinking beer? Beer is actually one of the oldest drinks humans ever produced. The first chemically confirmed barley beer dates back to the 5th millennium BC in Iran and was recorded in the written history of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia and spread through the world. Though the ancient Chinese artifacts suggest that beer brewed with grapes, honey, hawthorns, and rice was produced as far back as 7000 BC. Oh my, where do I begin? Fortunately, my guest today is the quintessential expert on everything beer. He's a legend in the beer world, a beloved teacher, a world-renowned scientist with an irresistible sense of humor, and much more. Dr. Charlie Bamforth is Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. He specializes in the malting and brewing sciences. He holds a PhD and a doctorate of science from the University of Hull in the UK. He has been part of the brewing industry since 1978. He is the recipient of an incredible number of prestigious awards and honors. He has held many leadership positions in the States and abroad, and has published more than 300 papers and articles, and has written or edited more than 20 books, several of which have been translated into other languages. Dr. Bamforth has been featured extensively in the media, recorded audiobooks, appeared in movies, and recorded several CDs. In 2020, he also filmed one of the courses for the Great Courses. And of note, he has written even more prolifically on soccer since 1985. After retiring from UC Davis in 2018, Dr. Bamforth still teaches classes at the UC Davis Continuing and Professional Education, and in January 2019, he took on the role of Senior Quality Advisor with Sierra Nevada. Hi, Dr. Bamforth. Great to see you.
It still works, you know.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your time. So,
it's nice to be with you.
Why beer? Tell me, why beer is good for you?
Oh, wow. I mean, people have known that for 8,000 years, ever since beer was accidentally discovered in what they refer to as the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia and so on. And beer is good for us because we're only here today because of beer. Those people throughout ages who drank water that was contaminated with pathogenic bacteria, they didn't live long enough. But those who drank beer live longer, because when you make beer, there's a boiling stage and it kills off all the pathogens, and so here we are. But apart from that, beer actually is not empty calories. There's some good nutritional value in beer. Even I wouldn't argue beer as the sole component of the diet, and really even I would argue that it really should be taken in moderation for its enjoyment factor. But it has been shown that in a number of ways, the moderate consumption of beer is good for you. So it's got a lot of silica in it, which is good for the bones. It's got antioxidants. It's got B vitamins. It's got soluble fiber. It's got prebiotics. It's got various other minerals as well. So beer is just a great drink, and but I stress again this aspect of responsibility and moderation.
Yes, we're going to talk a little more about moderation, and hopefully you'll be able to quantify moderation for us.
Oh, well, that's very hard. Moderation in in perhaps a factory worker in the Czech Republic is very different from moderation in some other quarters of life. But so it's not easy, but I'll do my best.
Well, you're putting your life at risk now, having said that. When you go to the doctors, they always say, well, how many drinks do you have a week? And 1, 2, 3. They don't specify the size of the glass and what you're drinking. And I always found it so empirical in a way.
Well, it is, and that relates to these observations that people have made for many years now, and they refer to it as the U-shaped curve or the J-shaped curve, which is the correlation between the relative risk of mortality and the number of units of alcohol you drink. And there have been many studies, both with wine drinking populations and beer drinking populations, that if you drink in moderation, so that will be the equivalent of perhaps 2 regular strength beers per day, which I'm meaning 4 or 5% ABV. Then that is the sweet spot, and that cuts down the risk of atherosclerosis, coronary heart disease. But then if you consume more alcohol than that, then the risks are going to increase from things like accidents and so on. But the problem is that, how do they draw those graphs, and where do they get the information from? And they get the information from what you and I tell the doctor. So, the doctor says to you, do you drink? And you say, yes. And the doctor says, well, how much do you drink? And you say, well, I just have a beer a day. And many people will be lying. They'd probably be having 2. Or I just have a glass of wine. Well, no, you're having half a bottle or something like that. So it's inherently inaccurate. And a drink is not a drink. Is not a drink. It could be anything from, in England, where I think we both hail from. The average alcohol concentration is substantially less than it is in the United States, and certainly less than it is in Canada, which is even higher. And the reason is that in the UK, tax is paid in proportion to alcoholic strength, alcohol by volume. So every 0.1% increase in alcohol means more duty, more tax, and that makes it more expensive. So that tends to keep the alcohol levels a little bit lower. If I can mention a couple of brand names, some people would say Guinness is good for you. That's how they used to advertise it when they were allowed to do it that way. That was the marketing. So the Irish company, Guinness is good for you. And then, of course, there's Budweiser. And there's more calories in a Bud than there is in a Guinness, because the main source of calories in a beer is the alcohol. And there's more alcohol by volume in a Budweiser than there is in a regular Guinness. So people get very confused. And again, it highlights the point that, not all beers are made equal. And, if you're drinking a 10% alcohol by volume product, then you're getting a lot more calories than if you're drinking a 4% alcohol by volume product.
What would you say people drink because of the taste, or because of the alcohol content, or both, or the way it pours, the way it looks?
All of those things. Well, all of those things matter. And one of the things that I'm always very fond of saying is you drink with your eyes, and that applies to anything that you are consuming, where by the broadest definition of the term consumption, you first of all make a judgment based on what your senses are telling you. So, I mean, if you buy a car, you probably aren't want to buy something that's an ugly car. Yeah, you're sure you want it to be efficient and run well and so on, but there's certain attributes of a vehicle that you're looking for, particularly if you want to impress other people. And so it is with a beer. You make your judgment right away from the branding. In these days when people talk about the craft industry, and I, for one, don't like that term, because all brewers are craftspeople, no matter how big they are. But a lot of people, they sort of look at the label and they say, "Oh, it's made by one of the big companies, therefore that can't be any good, can it?" Which is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. So they made a decision based on who's brewed it. And then they're going to be making a judgment based on the nature of the package and the appeal of that package. And then, assuming they're going to pour it out, Lynn, and I hope that most sensible people do actually pour out the beer into a glass, then they're going to make judgments about the foam and the color, and even more so these days on the clarity. I mean, I've been in the brewing industry since 1978, and for the vast majority of that time, I've been preaching to people to have beer that is really bright and not cloudy. Now, everybody's crying out and falling over one another to get the cloudiest beer possible. But whatever it is, it's got to be consistent. So if you're expecting a cloudy beer, then for goodness sake, the brewer's got to give you a cloudy beer, and fails if they don't, and vice versa. So people are making judgments all the time, and they've made a decision about what it's going to taste like even before they've tasted it. I've done a huge amount of work on this over the years. If you present a beer with a foam, then it invariably it's preferred to one that's presented without a foam. So yeah, the flavor is very, very important, but there's a lot of brand loyalty goes on. There are some regional loyalties in various parts of the world. It's a huge amount of psychophysics, should we say, behind this whole business of who chooses what beer. As long as they do choose beer, that's all that matters.
Charlie, let's talk about how do you make beer?
Well, how long have you got? I'll give you the short version.
Okay.
Most beer is made out of malted barley, so it's made out of grain. And the most widely used one is barley. So we're talking about the kernels, the seed, if you like, from the barley plant. And that is malted. So you basically take the grain, you steep it in water for a couple of days, and then you let it sprout for 4 or 5 days, and then you dry it to drive off the moisture. And depending on how you dry it, you can produce very pale colors and very light flavors, or you can go to the other extreme and you can produce very dark colors and very harsh burnt characters. So the flavor of something like Guinness is because it contains a proportion of very heavily roasted grain in there. And then, so you've got the malt. Now it's got to be stored for 4 weeks before you can use it. And then it will go to the brewery. The first thing they do is mill it. They grind it up into basically a powder, and they extract it in hot water. In that hot water, this is something called mashing. The enzymes, the catalysts that are made during the malting, they convert the starch into fermentable sugars. So if you're making wine, all you got to do is harvest the grapes and crush them, and the sugars are already pre-formed. So that's easy. But when you're making beer, you've got this long malting process, and then you've got to break down the starch to produce the fermentable sugars. So now we've got a liquid which is separated from the residual spent grains. Those grains go off to cattle feed. So the liquid, which is now called wort, is boiled, and it's boiled for about an hour, and it's boiled traditionally with hops. So hops in America and the world, in fact, the biggest growth location for hops is Yakima in Washington. There are smaller quantities in Oregon and Idaho, and historically in the Sacramento region. The malting barley, by the way, the biggest growth location is Idaho. So this wort is boiled with hops, and you extract the bitterness from the hops. And then after about an hour, it's clarified, and then you cool it down and add the yeast. Now we're going to have fermentation. And there are ale yeasts and there are lager yeasts. That's the main difference between an ale and a lager. So these yeasts are going to convert the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide and various other flavor components. And then after a period of time, which can be as short as 3 days or as long as, say, 2 weeks, then you have a maturation phase. You remove the yeast, you have a maturation phase, and then everything's chilled down and may be filtered and may be stabilized, and then it's packaged. And it's packaged into bottles at up to 1,200 bottles a minute, or cans at around 2,400 cans per minute, or in kegs, or back in Britain, it may be put into a road truck, a tanker, and shipped to large tanks in the bottom of working men's clubs for serving on draft dispense. And the other thing I did miss, a lot of the North American beers, the pale ales and the IPAs, some more hops are added right at the end after fermentation to extract the aroma, the very strong oils and so on. So that's all there is to it, really, and that's the elevator pitch on brewing. And I can teach you this over a period of 10 weeks' time if you've got long enough to learn about it. But so I've really given you just the bottom line.
What did you enjoy the most while you were working in your huge labs with all these strange?
Well, yeah, I enjoyed the research part, and of course UC Davis. People say it's a research university, and that's very important. And let's be frank, the way in which a science professor at UC Davis is very much judged is on the basis of their research output. But I have to confess that my favorite thing was the teaching. I loved teaching students, both on campus and also through what we now call the continuing professional education, the extension. And I just really enjoyed that. I began a class while I was there called FST3. It became the most popular class on campus. In any one year, we taught it 3 times with over 1,000 people. In fact, we put it also online as well. So really in advance of COVID. And so we actually had done this and made it available to all the campuses in the UC system. And that was the introduction to beer and brewing. It pushed the class on human sexuality into second place and the class on nutrition into third place. So I do like to think students know what their priorities are. But that was a lot of fun. And of course, there was the upper division classes as well. And it was very fulfilling, and seeing so many people progress into careers in the brewing industry and the related industries was tremendously satisfying. I tell you, it's ironic that although I'm not responsible for her, one of the lead scientists at Oxford, who's been working on the COVID vaccine in Oxford, she basically followed me through my career. She did her PhD at Hull University, as I did. Then she went to the Brewing Research Foundation International, which I did. And then she went to a biotechnology company that we set up when I was with Bass. So she followed me through. So, and that the reason I mention that is that brewing is a great vehicle for learning fermentation. And if you really have studied brewing, then you can apply that to any fermentation. And only recently I've been seeing people talking about the vaccine supply and how it's analogous to brewing and how there can be problems with supply. And I always go, no, if you understand what you're doing and you know how to do it and you understand fermentation, you can have a consistent fermentation every time. So brewing it's a wonderful vehicle to study science. And this, I remember when I first came to Davies in 1999. I was walking across campus and somebody asked me, I don't know what the circumstances were, who I was. And I said, I'm the new brewing professor. And there's a kind of a slight sneer in the corner of the upper lip. And I don't know if I said it at the time, but I certainly know it to be true, that to understand brewing, you've got to understand chemistry, biochemistry, microbiology, physics, chemical engineering, sensory science, and several other things as well, agronomy. botany, plant physiology, all of this comes together in the brewing of beer. So it really is a tremendous tool to understand science and the meaning of life.
It's fascinating, and of course, you know it all. I have.
Well, I don't know. I don't think I know it all, Lynn, but I know a bit.
In my introduction, I mentioned all your accomplishments and research and prestigious honors. But one thing that always attracted me to your lectures is your irresistible sense of humor. I've had so much fun.
I think it's important, and the students, for example, in that FST3 class, they certainly used to appreciate it. You know, I was never static. I was always moving around and having conversations with students and teasing them about their majors and so on. I think it became kind of memorable for them, and still people come up to me and say how much they enjoyed that and so on. And you know, lecturing at university certainly doesn't have to be dull. You know, it can be, and well, I mean, if you can't make beer and brewing fun, I mean, you know, there's no hope for you. So, it is something that I enjoy, and I like to dish out the teasing, but I'm very, very prepared to accept it. It's always good natured. As you know, when people refer to me as Dr. Bamforth, I say, no, Charlie, I'm Charlie. But just don't call me Mr. Bamforth, because I've got Doctor if you really want to be picky, but I vastly prefer Charlie. But
Charlie,
it's fun.
Well, Charlie, what about, there's two questions. The first one is, could you give us a ballpark figure, or I should say a soccer ball figure, since you are such a aficionado of soccer, aka football? Can you give us a figure of beer consumption around the world, approximately? Which are the country which consume the most?
Well, the country that consumes the most by a comfortable distance is the Czech Republic.
Really?
Didn't used to be the case. They became number one when Czechoslovakia divided into two nations, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. And the Slovaks were more for the wine, but for the beer. So they're number one. Number two is either Ireland or Germany at the moment. They are right up there. The big market for beer in the world is China. Now, individually, Chinese people don't drink very large quantities, but of course, there's a huge number of people in China. So if you go back to the 70s, there was probably only about 1 million barrels of beer brewed in the whole of China. Now it's, I'm not up to date, but it's going to be over 180 million barrels of beer brewed every year. So that's, and over the years, certainly when I was with the Basque company in the UK, we went into a partnership with a company in Manchuria. A good friend of mine actually went off to head up the operation in China. So many brewing companies, the tremendous opportunities that were in that market. So in the last few years, it's eased back a little bit. And indeed, one of the concerns that the brewers have got, and brewing scientists like I have got, is that in some of the traditional markets, the per capita consumption of beer is dipping. So even in the Czech Republic, Ireland, certainly in England, Denmark, the per capita consumption is in decline, and there are a number of reasons for that. People are still very interested here, but it is easing back somewhat, and that concerns me. There are some countries where it's come on quite well. Brazil is an example of that. Spain is an example of a country where they're actually shifting from wine into beer. So yeah, it's a funny old world out there. And of course, there are many brewers these days who are not only brewing beers as we know and love them, but they're producing all sorts of other things, flavored alcoholic beverages, alcoholic teas, alcoholic water, for goodness sake. I was referred to Luddites a while ago because I'm a great traditionalist. And if I think brewers are busy filling the fermenters with alcoholic lemon, then they're not filling them up with classic beers, in my opinion. But what do I know? It's what the customer wants. It's the customer is. But I hope that I and other people can educate the customer about the very real merits of beer as a pleasurable drink, as a healthy drink, and also the perfect accompaniment of food.
Can beer kill you if it's badly made?
No, I mean there's things the brewer has to do to be careful. Brewers do a lot of cleaning. If the cleaning solution gets to the wrong place at the wrong time, that's not a clever thing. But no, beer itself does not support the growth of pathogens, for example. So, and if you leave beer, store it too long, it's not going to somehow develop anything that's going to cause illness. It won't do the flavor any good, but it certainly won't kill you. But yes, I mean, it's like anything else, absolutely anything else. If you take it to excess, then it's not going to do you any good. But I could, and I won't, I could rattle off pretty much everything else that's on the dinner table or the breakfast table. And if you take any of those things to excess, then they're not going to do you any good. So you think of pretty much any item that you have in a traditional English breakfast. If you eat those things to an excess, then there are things in there that are not going to do any good. A beer, although that's not for breakfast usually, beer as well is something that you, again, to use that term, should treat with respect and moderately. And again, you asked the question about what is moderation. My personal definition of moderation is a couple of beers maximum per day, and not all 14 on Saturday night. That's not a good idea.
Oh, you've reappeared. Your image had disappeared for a few minutes, but that's okay. Sorry. We could hear your voice, which is just as good.
Right. Well, some people say I've got a far better face for radio anyway, so there you
go. Quickly before our internet has glitches again, the 5-minute history of beer by Charlie.
Okay. So ancient Mesopotamia, or the Fertile Crescent, people had a nomadic existence. They wandered around driving goats in search of grass. They carried with them barley grain. That's what they ate. It was hard, it was tough, it was unpleasant. But somebody got it wet, it started to sprout, got softer. They could bite into it, tasted like bean sprouts. Then they found they could make it into a bread. They baked it, tasted really good now, tasted like malted milk balls or cornflakes. And then they found that if they stored that in jars and it got wet, something happened. We now know it was yeast that converted the sugars into alcohol. They put their finger in it, tasted good. They drank it, they fell over. They thought this is good. So they stopped the nomadic existence. They grew the grain and they carried out the malting and the brewing processes. They put the tents in a circle. Those tents became villages. Those villages became towns and cities like Sacramento. So here we are. Over the years then, brewing emerged progressively, went through the church. So the monks traditionally were the brewers, and the other people who were the brewers was the lady of the house, the woman, who would brew regularly. So women routinely brewed. So the men were out in the fields and the women were raising the kids and doing the cooking, but also making beer. And then they branched out and they opened the back room and they started selling the beer, and those became the first brew pubs. And then came the advent of the steam engine. And when they invented the steam engine, so that allowed for heavy industry. So industry developed, so the people stopped the rural activities, they went to work in factories, and therefore, rather than brew the beer themselves, they bought the beer from large supply brewers. They called them the common brewers. So big names came forward like Bass and Whitbread and Watney and so on. Later, Guinness. So big brewers started developing, and here we are. And then Jimmy Carter signed the legislation in 1978, which made home brewing legal on a federal level. And therefore, people who had already been home brewing, they now basically came out of the closet and they started to develop their own brewing companies. And one of those, the company that I'm now associated with since retiring from campus, Sierra Nevada, Ken Grossman started Sierra Nevada with the two most beautiful breweries in the world, in Chico and Mills River. And so here we are. That's the history of brewing.
Wonderful. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm so thankful that you took the time to talk to us, and I'm sure the Davis Media Access will be delighted to have this interview. And I thank you very much, and I wish you the very best during the pandemic and afterwards.
Thank you, Len. It's always a pleasure.